90 days was barely enough time to outfit them, train them, and prepare them for the field. So what the president then authorized are called volunteers. It's like a militia, and essentially it can be called up by the governor again, but this time there's no 90-day window. And therefore, most of the units you'll see fighting in the Civil War, for example, will be these volunteer units that will be called up by states. So let's make a distinction for that as we start looking at Utah Territory here. So when the Mormons run out of Missouri and settle in Illinois, and then again begin to organize themselves, they form a militia called the Nauvoo Legion. And again, this is not out of the normal. These were called up and signed off by the Illinois governor. There were militias all across Utah, or all across Illinois. What was concerning for residents in Illinois was the structure and the organization and how well they were run. Ultimately then, when the LDS faithful are pushed out of Nauvoo, the Illinois governor will detract or take away the official militia status for the Nauvoo Legion. And as the Mormons are moving their way into Utah, what you'll see then is the militia is now scattered, is no longer organized, and they'll arrive here in Salt Lake City disorganized and not officially as a militia. And we'll talk about how their organization would be. So here's a quick timeline of once they've arrived here in Utah. Of course, in 1847, the first saints will arrive here, and in 1849 will be the establishment of the organization of the state of Deseret. If you look at the paperwork for the state of Deseret, you'll find there's a militia clause in there. If you read paragraph by paragraph, the militia clause is almost identical to many militia descriptions in territories all throughout the country. 1850, when Utah Territory is established, then under that will be another second militia clause under that, organizing it virtually identical word for word to the Deseret, state of Deseret militia. So by 1850 then, there's an officially recognized state militia. And here's the advantage of a militia. You can receive federal dollars to underwrite your militia. So the idea is that the president wants to be able to call upon a militia for use. Then there is what's called the 1808 Militia Act that allows for federal money each year to be allocated to the state militias. And based on the number of individuals in your militia, then they would allocate dollar resources in terms of muskets. If you saved up your annual allocation, you could actually purchase artillery. For example, here is an original Utah Territorial Militia cannon. It was issued by the U.S. government in 1852 to the Utah Territorial Militia, transported here to Utah Territory. It was here on the grounds in 1857, then when the Utah War breaks out. There's some irony there that the very cannon given by the Army could actually be turned around and faced against them when the Utah War happens. What's interesting if you look at this timeline is that the militia was organized in Utah Territory and they would be allowed to languish at some point once their use was no longer needed. When another emergency came up, they would reorganize them. So for example, you'll notice that in 1852, the Nauvoo Legion is reorganized again and pressed into service. Why? Because it's right at the beginning of the Wakara War. Again, in 1857, the Nauvoo Legion will be reorganized, new officers appointed, kind of revitalized. Why? Because now we have the Utah War coming. What's interesting then to us is that in 1861, the Nauvoo Legion is reorganized yet another time. And why would you do that? Well, we probably all know that. The coming of the Civil War. So several things are happening both in the East and in the West. As the Civil War breaks out in the East, all the federal troops in the West are being pulled east. So many of the military forts are either completely evacuated or partially evacuated. So here in Utah Territory, of course, we have Fort Bridger, at the very edge of the eastern edge of Utah Territory. We have Camp Floyd, and then in 1860, there's a post called Fort Churchill established on the California-Nevada border. 3 forts whose intent was to help to protect travel on the trail. Camp Floyd is completely closed in 1861 as this fort is being evacuated, and the Army pulls out of the central area in Utah Territory. So this creates an opportunity then and a political dynamic that shifts in Utah. And Brigham Young takes advantage of that by having the organization reorganized. General Wells is the commander of the Nauvoo Legion. We'll introduce him in just a moment. But in August of 1861, he issues an order, and it says, it's sent out to all of his district commanders, and it says, you will quietly, meaning not really loudly and publicly in publishing, but you're going to quietly revive the military throughout the territory. And why? It says, what we wish is to have our military organization as perfect as possible and to have the implements of war on hand and in good order. Now is a favorable opportunity to obtain guns and ammunition. So you see a preparation then for a change in politics in the Civil War here in Utah Territory. When that order arrives here in Salt Lake City, at the district office here in Salt Lake City, General Richards will issue a reason for why he thinks this should happen. He says, no particular danger is now felt that requires these orders to be issued, but the present is the first proper time that has presented itself since our territory was occupied by a government mob to put our militia in the state of self-defense. And in the end of his letter, he points out what the militia may be used for. He recognizes that the militia may be called up by the President of the United States to serve in the Civil War, and it may be used as a home guard. And we'll see that that will happen. All right, so who's eligible in the Civil War for service in the Utah Territorial Militia? We had to be white, you had to be male, and between the ages of 18 and 45. Those were the official designated restrictions. You'll also notice if you look at the roster, there are a number of non-Mormon Gentiles living in Salt Lake City. None of their names ever appear on any of the rosters. So while it's not officially part of the requirement, you will see that unofficially it is a member of the LDS Church would be an element of their service. It's a great photograph. These men are proud of their service. You'll see many, many personal portraits, daguerreotypes and CDV full portraits of them in their uniform. Once they've obtained a uniform of some kind, here's a Brigham Young son who will be, in fact, in the earlier meeting, he's the one who sent back east in 1862 with Hooper to go to Washington, D.C. Here he is in his Nauvoo Legion uniform, taken during the Civil War. Now, as a militia member, you were required to supply a lot of your own supplies. This was not an organized standing army like we would think of the army today. So you provided your own weapon, you provided your own black powder, your own lead, you had a percussion weapon, you had to provide your percussion caps. If you were a cavalryman, you provided your own horse and saddle. You also provided your own uniform if that was going to be used. Many officers purchased their own uniforms, and we'll see in the photographs here shortly. Most of them are derived from Civil War uniforms. And the other requirement, of course, is to attend the annual muster where training would take place. If you look at this photograph, this is a great snapshot. This is taken in 1865, showing the muster here in Salt Lake City. And you get a sense of what the uniforms look like. It's a mixture of everything. They've all got black hats on of different styles, different homespun shirts, but they've got their belt and their powder and their weapon, and they're ready to serve as infantrymen. Notice there's an officer standing right here. He, of course, is wearing the typical U.S. Army uniform of the period that he has purchased. It's interesting when we look at uniforms, incidentally, that we'll find a lot more uniforms in Salt Lake City, where there's a little bit more wealthy, a little bit more, the economy is a lot better. The further we move north and the further we move south into the frontier settlements, the less and less we'll see proper uniforms. During the Civil War, the Nauvoo Legion, the Territorial Militia, numbered about 9,000 men. And they're divided into 4 sections as we would in the 19th century army at the time. Infantry, guys who march and fight on foot. The cavalry, those who fight on horseback. Artillery, guys who fire cannons. And then the staff and band and kind of the auxiliary. And what you'll notice, of course, is that the infantry makes up virtually 75% of the Nauvoo Legion during the Civil War. In part, it's because it's the least expensive and the easiest to be able to field. Cavalry represents about 22%, almost a quarter of them of the Nauvoo Legion at this time. And then you'll see there's a tiny sliver, less than 1%. There's only 2 artillery units, one here in Salt Lake and one in Ogden. And then staff represent the leading officers that run the departments in the districts. And of course they have bands. Here in Utah we love music, don't we? So we had to have military bands, and so most of these military bands were also playing bands in Salt Lake City, and then they would put their military uniform on, becoming martial band for the Nauvoo Legion. There's lots of great photographs of them in their band uniforms with their band instruments at various places around Salt Lake City. In fact, here's the Croxall's Band, which is one of the famous bands well into the 1890s here in Salt Lake City, played at many of the events. Here they are with their instruments. Incidentally, anyone know what this kind of triangle thing up here is?
Sibley tent.
Yeah, it's a Sibley tent. Where would you get a Sibley tent from?
Utah.
Yeah, the U.S. Army. So in 1861, when Camp Floyd was being closed down, it was the largest Army surplus sale you could ever imagine. And virtually everything the Army didn't take back with them, from uniforms to Sibley tents to a variety of other equipment, was then purchased. And many of those went into the Nauvoo Legion then to help support and equip the Nauvoo Legion here in Utah. So officers, they enlisted the men who out in the leadership for the Nauvoo Legion. Typically in a militia, they were elected. The senior officers were selected by the governor, the rest were elected positions. What we'll see in the Nauvoo Legion is a very slightly different take on that. Most of them were selected by church officials. They were oftentimes community leaders in their community or in their church. And then there would be a vote, or what's called a sustaining vote. In other words, there would be name would be presented, and virtually every officer then would be sustained by unanimous vote into their position. And again, as you'll see here, here's another example of one of the officers in a very classic Civil War uniform, officer's uniform of the period. Many of these officers, especially in the Salt Lake area, then purchased uniforms to be able to lead. And here's a great shot. This one sometimes gets confused with actually taken as officers at Camp Floyd, but this is the 3rd Infantry and some of the regimental staff from the Salt Lake District here for the Nauvoo Legion just outside in 1865. Incidentally, the reason we have all these great photographs from November of 1865 is that 2 of the officers in the 3rd Regiment of Infantry here in Salt Lake City were none other than Savage and Ottinger, 2 famous photographers. Ottinger will go on to become the first Adjutant General for the Utah National Guard. So all these things connect together over time. All right. What about training? How do you train the Nauvoo Legion? There was only a modest amount of individuals within the Nauvoo Legion who had military experience. Some had been in the Mormon Battalion. A few had served in the U.S. Army or the British Army. But for the most part, most of those serving had never served in the military before. And so training was a challenge. 1862, there are several documents that indicate that officers or individuals returning from the Civil War back east were deciding that Nauvoo Legion was poorly trained. So in 1864, Colonel David Ross was appointed the training officer. His job was to standardize all training for the Nauvoo Legion. And in 1865, they actually published an actual infantry book. All right, so I'm going to run out of time, so I will talk a little faster. Flags, of course, they have various kinds of flags, many with religious symbols, etc. on those. I'm going to skip through the table of organization, the Great Salt Lake Military District, and here's a photograph of the light artillery. So what was their job? What did the Nauvoo Legion do in Utah? In Salt Lake City, in the core area here close to the capital, they did a variety of things. So for example, not only did Lots 100 go out, prior to that, 3 days prior to that, Colonel Burton was actually sent out originally to patrol the trail based on the governor's recommendation. 3 days after they left, they were actually at the top of Parley's Canyon when Major Smith, or when word was received from the War Department to formulate another company, and Smith will be sent out. They guarded prisoners here in downtown Salt Lake City. They escorted dignitaries, they did parades and demonstrations, and of course next door you can have a chance to listen to the Morrisite War. The Nauvoo Legion will have used in 1862 to arrest and lay siege to the Morrisites and bring them in. 1862, of course, one of the most controversial issues will happen is the arrival of the United States Army. Colonel Patrick Edward Conner will arrive in 1862. We'll send the Nauvoo Legion, will be actually called up to guard the Temple Square, and we create a political dynamic between the U.S. Army and the Nauvoo Legion. Just to give you an illustration of one of the examples, in 1864, Conner decided to occupy a building downtown Salt Lake to be able to round up soldiers who were getting in trouble downtown drinking. And so he selected this particular building right here. This is Hiram Clausen's warehouse, and he occupied it with a flagpole here. It had a company of armed men sent down. I should point out they arrived on a Sunday morning while the temple was full, and when the temple folks came out of the temple, they suddenly discovered the U.S. Army had raised a flag and was right across the street. There's the south gate of Temple Square. This photograph is taken as the temple's being built and is looking down. This is South Temple right here. It was right across from the Temple Square. A very provocative movement. So in summary, I should point out that the use of the Nauvoo Legion was different in Salt Lake City versus the frontier. Those in the Cache Valley down in southern Utah were being used to fight Indians, were being used as part of the defensive as the frontier was being pushed north and south. Here in Salt Lake City, they were used for dignitaries, they were used for police force, and a variety of other forces to help protect the home front. I'll end by mentioning just a final incident in 1865. It's very interesting that in 1865, the Nauvoo Legion was doing their final annual muster out just near Salt Lake City, and they invited Patrick Edward Conner to come down and review the troops. And as they walked through, got a personal VIP of the trip, and he was asked to stay for the muster, for the final review. Connor then was giving discussions, and in the discussion discovered that Brigham Young was on his way out to also to review the troops. The two had never actually met. Their handlers had kept them apart. According to the Deseret News, Colonel Connor suddenly realized he had a forgotten appointment and departed Salt Lake City very quickly, heading up back to the fort. The Nauvoo Legion then did their review. They were dismissed by the governor, and the last step was they marched over to the Beehive House, where they were dismissed yet a second time by Brigham Young, illustrating the dichotomy that you'll see that's unique for the Nauvoo Legion. All right, thank you.